I'm Garrett Salpeter, and I believe that the most powerful and transformative way to help people recover from pain and injury, heal from trauma, and reach their highest levels of fitness and performance is to focus on the nervous system. In this podcast, we'll share knowledge from the frontiers of neuroscience and inspirational stories of how applying that knowledge has empowered people from all walks of life to heal, adapt, and grow. Hello, NeuFit Nation, and welcome back to the Undercurrent podcast. This is going to be another solo episode that is a fast follow to the previous one. So we just had episode 109, where I did an episode called The Neuroscience of Leadership. And while thinking about that one, I started thinking about another topic that's very popular right now, and that is the topic of longevity. And thought it would be really worthwhile to look at that through a neuroscience lens as well. And I'm particularly inspired by some recent experiences I had around meditation, which I'll get into. And this is just a really interesting topic that I've been able to, in my own experience recently, to connect some very interesting dots. And I felt like it was the right time to come on and share this with you. And as you can imagine, myself being a former engineer, I'm going to take a very logical and methodical approach. And at the same time, also going to talk about things that may feel a little more subjective and woo-woo, like meditation. But part of what I mentioned is my recent epiphanies and understanding are going to be the ways that these different areas connect. And so I hope you find this as fascinating as I do. Looking at this methodical, objective framework for the neuroscience of longevity, there's three main pillars that I want to talk about. So when we talk about this topic, there's mechanisms, underlying mechanisms here. Like the first pillar is going to be the autonomic nervous system and health. So we're going to talk about sympathetic parasympathetic balance and how this often is the root cause of many issues when it comes to chronic disease or when it comes to health and things working well. We're going to talk about then pillar number 2, which is neuroplasticity. And this has to do a lot with use it or lose it, right? A lot of aging has to do with decline, cognitive decline, physical decline. And so use it or lose it is relevant there versus finding ways to harness the positive side of neuroplasticity to improve cognitively, physically. And this has to do with the neuromuscular system. It has to do with the psychology. There's many applications there that we'll get into. And then the third pillar is going to be psychoneuroimmunology. And this is a segue from neuroplasticity because neuroplasticity describes how our brain functions or how it changes in function over time based on the patterns and habits that we develop in the environment, the stimulus, the input that we experience. And psychoneuroimmunology is this fascinating field that describes how the psychology and the nervous system influence the immune system and vice versa. And of course, that will go back to the top when we talk about autonomic function and health. One of the topics that we discuss throughout that is going to be inflammation. There's this very well-studied, well-researched and published phenomenon called inflammaging, the combination of inflammation and aging, and how excess chronic inflammation is one of the most significant causes of the various types of decline that happen during aging. So we're going to link all of these together. Hopefully that makes sense and has you on the edge of your seat wanting to hear more. The first pillar, first topic is, as I said, the autonomic nervous system. And to me, this really is the root cause, because if you look at what the autonomic nervous system controls, it controls things like blood pressure, digestive function, right? The way we break down and absorb the nutrients from food, the way we eliminate waste. It controls all of our hormones, including, adrenaline, stress hormones, cortisol, including thyroid, including the sex hormones, testosterone, estrogen, DHEA, all these different things. And so the autonomic nervous system in many ways is the first domino. If you look at so many of the health challenges, actually look at what are the most prescribed medications. We're going to talk about meditation later. What are the most prescribed medications? Blood pressure medicine, right? And that's controlled by the autonomic nervous system. Laxatives and issues for digestion. Those are very, very significant, very commonly prescribed. That's an area directly controlled by the nervous system. There's huge, huge connections here, and I want to talk about this from a couple angles. The first is understanding how the nervous system, how the autonomic nervous system is that first domino for health, and how if we spend too much time in that sympathetic fight or flight state, right? If we have excess stress and an inability to recover from that stress, we spend too much time in a state that signals high blood pressure and increased heart rate in order to mobilize energy, too much time in a state that reduces the activity of the digestive system, so we can't as effectively break down and absorb the nutrients from food, can't as effectively eliminate waste, right? So you can see how that's problematic. We don't have the raw materials for energy and for structural proteins for building our body up, building it back up after it has been challenged or just used. And then we don't have the energy and resources for longer term processes. Again, spending too much time in a sympathetic fight or flight state, spending too much time there, we don't have the energy and resources for longer term rebuild and repair processes. That includes reproduction, right? The reproductive organs. Think about how big of an issue it is these days. Infertility. We hear all these different things. So that is controlled by the autonomic nervous system as well. That literally sends nerve supply to the reproductive organs and also triggers the various hormones that act on those organs or that are secreted by those organs. So it really is the first domino. And then, I mentioned blood pressure. The autonomic nervous system controls blood flow. It can dilate or constrict all the blood vessels in the body, right? That's controlled by the nerves. There's also a direct connection between the brain, the vagus nerve, and the organs of the immune system, like the spleen and thymus. So there's a really powerful connection there between the autonomic nervous system and the immune system. And this is where I want to dive a little deeper into that topic of inflammaging. And the effect of the nervous system on the immune system is very interesting because it's kind of a dose dependent or a phased effect where acute stress increases immune function, which means more inflammation, which in a short-term context is helpful, right? If you get a cut on your skin and you have a risk of infection, having a little bit of a stress response to mobilize energy and resources, including immune cells, so they can go there, clean up debris, fight off any potential invaders to reduce the risk of infection, that's valuable. The problem, however, becomes when one is stuck in that stress, sympathetic dominant state for too long, and the immune activity is chronically elevated. So that, of course, can be problematic for many reasons, but one is that inflammaging happens. Whenever the immune system works, when it goes to fight off an infection, it creates collateral damage. It's sort of, I don't love in many ways in biology the metaphors around fighting, but in many ways, if you look at the immune system work, it is like soldiers on a battlefield in a war. They're going to fight the enemy, which would be the invading pathogen, and there's going to be collateral damage, right? The earth, the ground around that, structures get damaged. And so the more inflammation is present, the better we can defend against certain pathogenic invaders, but the more collateral damage there's going to be throughout the system. And so that can lead to a variety of issues over time. But one, for instance, is excess inflammation in the bloodstream that can damage the lining of blood cell walls, or if there is any blood vessel walls, or if there is any damage, excess inflammation is what actually causes the buildup of plaque there. That's an inflammation-driven process, which of course leads to cardiovascular disease, risks of heart attack, stroke, etc. So it's very, very relevant here in many ways. And what we want to have is a healthy immune response, right? We don't want to have excess inflammation. We want to have enough to fight pathogens, but not too much. So managing this is really important. And when I think about that idea, that notion of balancing or optimizing inflammation, it's not too little, not too much. I also really think about stress hormones and the circadian rhythm and the rhythm of the day, right? Because we don't want to just have the same level of energy all day long. We want to have a boost in the morning that actually triggers us to wake up from sleep. There should be a rise in cortisol, for example, in the morning. Cortisol being a stress hormone or hormone secreted by the sympathetic nervous system in order to mobilize energy, especially blood sugar, to give us the energy, the resources that we need to meet a challenge. So it actually is a challenge. It actually is a stressor on the system to wake up in the morning. And so we do want to see a rise in cortisol. And that gives us the boost that we need to have, many people report, myself included, having their best cognitive abilities in the first several hours of the day. So back when I was writing my book, for example, I would write for a couple hours every morning because that's when my mind was the most sharp, my enthusiasm was the highest, and I just got my best work done. So that was really useful. It also can be a great time to work out. And one of the cool things about that is that triggers an increase in cortisol in the morning. And if you do it regularly, the body adapts to where it actually happens proactively. You start to get that increase even before you do the activity. And so when you have a regular circadian rhythm, you can get this type of scenario where you sort of ride an energy wave, where you get a boost of energy in the morning, and that helps you do your most productive work. And then later in the day, you can ride that same wave to sleep at night. It will help you wind down. And of course, doing things like, reducing blue light, wearing blue light blocking glasses, or having a screen filter on your phone after dark, stuff like that can be very helpful. Not trying to do very cognitively or physically demanding tasks at the end of the day, because you can adapt to that as well. But the problem happens when we're mismatched, when we're lethargic during the day. Of course, those of us who are not shift workers, right? Most people. So setting that aside, the problem happens when we feel lethargic during the day when we want to be more energetic and productive, but then we feel wired at night when we want to be able to fall asleep. So finding ways to set and influence that circadian rhythm. So, there's a lot of conversation, and Andrew Huberman on his podcast talks almost every chance he gets about viewing morning sunlight, and that's great because that helps the brain get the memo that, hey, yes, it is time to wake up. And there's he's a vision scientist, and so he spells out in detail the pathways by which light hitting the retina of the eye, going through the optic nerve, actually triggers a lot of activity in the brain that activates the sympathetic nervous system and leads to the secretion of various hormones, including cortisol. So there's a lot there. If you're, depending on the time of year and the latitude at which you live, you may wake up before the sun, and that, whereas I'm recording this, we're just getting out of the summer, getting into the early fall here, and I'm starting to see that again, where I have a more significant period of time between when I wake up and when the sun comes out. So that's when I use my red light panel. I don't use it as much during the summer, but in the lower light times of year, I have this very bright red light panel that I'll use, and I'll put that on in the morning and do a little bit of reading or some work on my phone or next to it, a little bit of mobility work depending on the day and what it is. But I do like to work out and do more cognitively demanding activities in the morning because it helps trigger this nice circadian rhythm where our autonomic nervous systems can be working for us rather than against us, and we can sort of ride that wave of energy levels that are optimized at the times of day we want. More energy early, and then being able to sort of wind down into sleep later in the evening. And one other point that I'll mention here is energy. So looking at energy ultimately, I think, is the currency of life, right? When we die, we stop making ATP. There's a whole interesting discussion there about rigor mortis and muscle stiffening, but we'll set that aside for now. Muscle stiffening, because that's actually the lowest energy state. It takes energy to relax between contractions and keep muscles more supple and pliable. So interesting aside. But the fact that we today, so many of us have to rely on caffeine and feel like we can barely have enough energy to make it through the day, that is a problem, because that tells us that we're having to go to the well, so to speak, relying on these sympathetic nervous system hormones and having to spend an excess amount of time in that state. So the really looking through the lens of energy, I think is a huge deal, because if we just by default have enough energy to get through our day and then have some left over for longer term growth and repair, that's healthy. And whenever we deviate from that, that means we don't have enough energy for the immune system to do its last little bits of cleanup. And perhaps those cells that weren't able to be attended to and cleaned up, maybe they turn into a cancerous tumor down the road. Perhaps it's the inability or not having enough energy to repair the extra fibers of a fascia, tendon, ligament, muscle, etc., and that becomes the weak link that gets injured the next time you go out to play your sport. Whatever it might be, energy ultimately is the thing that we need to have. And so, one of the things that I really invite you to ask yourself right now is, one, do you wake up in the morning feeling alert and alive and like you have enough energy to get out of bed and start your day? Two, do you generally have enough energy to do the tasks that you wish to be able to do or need to be able to do during the day? Three, do you need caffeine either in the morning or in the afternoon? If you do have an afternoon slump in energy, can you rest or go for a walk, unplug, whether it be a quick nap, meditation, or go out and take a walk in nature, for 10 or 20 minutes? Is that enough to rejuvenate you? Because some of that I still think is normal and healthy and is okay. The problem becomes when a little bit of a lull in the afternoon, I'll say, is okay. As long as a little bit of a rest like that, it's okay to rest and unplug. It's actually necessary, right? We should be able to have focus blocks, but not be able to focus, for hours and hours and hours on end. We need cognitive and physical breaks. So that type of thing is okay. But really reflect on the answers to these questions. And if the answer to any of those questions is no, it could be that you are having an imbalance here in this sympathetic dominant, spending too much time in the sympathetic dominant state without enough time to recover. And it could be this whole scenario of, all these different stresses and challenges of modern life, the emails, the deadlines, the schedules, especially with kids, plus work, plus school, plus after school activities, depending on your situation, that may or may not be part of it. But with all that, we're having to just constantly be on, and that can be problematic. So there's ways to help balance that out, some of which we'll talk about in the next pillar as we talk about neuroplasticity, because there are ways that we can leverage the power of neuroplasticity to change and reduce stress overall. One of them is going to be meditation, and I'll talk about that. But before we totally move on from the autonomic nervous system, I do want to talk about ways to measure it. So we've talked in other episodes of this podcast about heart rate variability, which you likely know about if you have a Whoop or an Oura Ring or a Fitbit or an Apple Watch or one of those types of devices, or even a sleep mattress that measures this. You likely see heart rate variability perhaps every morning, like I do with my Whoop. And heart rate variability is essentially a measure of the autonomic nervous system. Generally speaking, with some exceptions, but generally speaking, more is better, unless it's symptomatic of something like an overtraining, overreaching, or illness, or something like that. But generally speaking, more is better, because it means that you have more parasympathetic rest and digest, or feed and breed type of activity, where you're able to spend enough time in that state where you're recovering from the demands of the day, rebuilding, replenishing energy stores, investing energy and resources in those longer term growth and repair processes. And just to foreshadow a little bit, one of the other things that we'll talk about, on my Whoop, I've seen this amazing thing where I do this journal and track my activities. And now that I've been tracking meditation for a few months, I've seen that it is the single biggest positive impact on my recovery scores. Meditation helps increase, according to this Whoop journal recovery insights feature, increases my recovery by 9%, which is amazing. Wearing blue light blocking glasses at night, for reference, increases it by 4%, as does viewing morning sunlight. Being on vacation, taking a vacation day, is also a positive 4%. Just for reference, things like caffeine, when I have caffeine, that's a minus 2% for me. Intermittent fasting, interestingly enough, is a minus 3 for me. So that's a different topic, but related to the autonomic nervous system, because when we're fasting, of course, that's a time of lower nutrients. And so the body has to activate the sympathetic nervous system to mobilize energy. And that is something that is, can be helpful, but also we have to understand that it is a stressor and it has to be managed and applied appropriately. So that I was just looking at my Whoop app there for a moment, but the effect of meditation has been profound. So I think measuring heart rate variability is something to pay attention to, and doing an experiment like this on your own, seeing how different things that you may try, different interventions or lifestyle habits, see how those actually affect your heart rate variability, because that ultimately is one of the best ways to answer this question of how healthy your autonomic nervous system balance is, along with answering those questions earlier about energy. How do you feel when you wake up in the morning? Do you have enough energy to do all the activities of your day? Can just a short break, if you have an afternoon lull, a short break give you enough to be able to continue on your day, without having to resort to a sugary snack or caffeinated drink, etc. So now we'll segue into neuroplasticity, and this has to do, of course, with brain function. And so we will talk about meditation, but first I want to talk even a little more about the brain from the standpoint of motor control and the neuromuscular system. And when you talk about longevity, one of the most important factors, of course, is preventing serious injury, preventing accidental death. And so talking about falls and the risk of falls and why falls are one of the top killers of independence, and ultimately, there's this really compelling data that shows a substantial percentage of elderly people who have a fall, an injury, break their hip in a fall or have a serious injury from a fall, there's a serious increase in mortality in the subsequent 6 to 12 months. So a large percentage of the people who have a fall and a significant injury at an advanced age, a significant percentage of those people do die within the 6 to 12 months following that fall for a whole host of reasons. And one of the things that I really want to talk about here is to use this as a segue into the notion of neuroplasticity for the neuromuscular system, and really talking about use it or lose it. So there's some great studies. One book recommendation I'll make is The Brain That Changes Itself by Norman Doidge. It's a great book. And in that book, he talks about studies that looked at monkeys they actually did these neuroscience studies where they would look at the brains of monkeys. So it can be a little brutal, right? They had to actually open the skull and look at electrical activity and poke into the brains to see parts of the brain that are active. So they did these studies where they found, for example, the part of the brain that was paying attention to a finger. Say it was the second finger on the monkey's left hand. And then they would, again, brutal for the sake of science, but they would amputate that second finger, and they would watch what happened to that brain area. And the brain area was getting no stimulation, no input, right? Because that finger's gone. And so the brain areas that looked at the first and third finger, the fingers right next to the one that was cut off, those brain areas actually crept in and took over that real estate in the brain that had been monitoring the second finger. So use it or lose it definitely applies here. The body overall doesn't want to spend the energy and resources to build or even maintain very electrically expensive brain tissue and neurological pathways that aren't being used. And so it will downregulate activity there. And in this case, it got taken over by another. In some cases, it'll just atrophy or die altogether. So here, the segue or the connection to humans and the fall risk is that the same sort of thing happens in humans, where if we, for instance, wear, as many people do, thick-soled shoes, even in the house, right? People have house shoes, then they put on thick-soled shoes to go outside. They dampen the input the neurological stimulus that happens on the bottoms of the feet. So there's less and less stimulus, less sensation coming from the bottoms of the feet. And a similar thing can happen to them as happens to the monkeys who had a finger cut off, where the parts of that person's brain that were paying attention to their feet, those parts actually atrophy or get taken over by parts of the brain that are monitoring other areas of the body. And so there's a deficit in the brain's ability, in the nervous system's ability to monitor the feet. And therefore, when that person begins to lose their balance, they're not able to get that signal up into the central nervous system quickly enough. And the brain doesn't have enough, isn't paying attention, isn't monitoring that closely enough to be able to make the subtle, slight adjustments to catch one's balance before toppling over and falling. So this is very, very relevant. And so the way to correct this is to understand neuroplasticity and the dark side of neuroplasticity, which is use it or lose it, right? Neuroplasticity doesn't always mean positive. It just means change in response to stimulus and input. So in this example, the change is use it or lose it. The change is losing it in response to a lack of input. So the flip side of that, the more positive, more promising, inspiring side, is to say that if there is proper input, enough of that over time, then you can maintain or even improve those pathways. And so spending time barefoot, ideally not just on flat ground indoors, but outside in nature, in the grass, something like that. Being able to use technology like the newbie on the feet. These can all be super valuable for reinforcing those pathways, for stimulating those pathways, helping the body understand that, yes, these pathways are important. Yes, it is worth the energy and resources to maintain or even build and make stronger those pathways. So there's, that same principle can be applied throughout the whole body, and why it's important to mobilize all of the joints of the body, use our body through its full range of motion, because use it or lose it applies very much there, not only to the nervous system and motor control, but also then physically to the connective tissue, which will shorten to accommodate the ranges in which it's used over time. So hopefully that makes sense and inspires the need for movement, and helps understand why, a lot of cultures that have practices like Tai Chi and Qigong, you'll go out into a park at sunrise and see dozens of elderly people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s doing these practices, and why they still look so supple and mobile and flexible. It's because they are, challenging and using and maintaining the abilities to use their bodies throughout these full ranges of motion. So they maintain the motor control, the neurological pathways, and the physical structures, the integrity of those physical structures. It's also, I think, one, if I could just tie a bow on that actually before we move on, I think there's a great quote that I've seen in many places. One is in The Biology of Belief by Bruce Lipton, where he talks about we're either growing or we're dying, right? And this, it may sound bleak, but there's a lot of truth in this. We're either getting better and improving, or if we're not intentionally improving, then the default is actually to regress, to break down, to atrophy in order to conserve energy, right? Like we've talked about. So I think the takeaway message here is finding ways physically and cognitively to continue to attempt to improve. Find an area in your life, ideally at least one physically and at least one cognitively, where you can continue to work towards mastery and work towards pushing the boundaries of your ability. Find ways to continue to get better, because that is satisfying in its own right. You'll continue doing it if it's something that you enjoy and is meaningful to you. And that is a way to harness this power of neuroplasticity for long-term cognitive and physical health. So hopefully that all lands and makes sense. And now I also want to talk about a little bit of the, perhaps softer side of neuroplasticity. And this is where we'll segue into meditation. I want to talk about, though, this concept that I first learned in a book called The Comfort Crisis by Michael Easter, where he talks about the research of a guy named David Lavari, who's now at Brown, did most of this research back when he was at Harvard. But he talks about this concept of prevalence-induced concept change. So prevalence meaning how prevalent, how frequently we see something, and then how that can tweak or change our perception of it. So there's this notion of comfort creep and problem creep. Comfort creep being how we can adapt to things that bring us pleasure. It's like someone wins the lottery and they have all this, excitement and pleasure for a year or two, and then they eventually they go back to their baseline level of happiness. They get used to that. And the same thing holds true if someone moves into a new house or experiences something for the first time, where there's eventually like an adaptation, the point where someone needs more. And then there's also problem creep, which is when things get better, we have this survival bias. We're always looking at potential problems because they could be threats to survival. And this negativity bias is hardwired into us. And so when things get better, when there's fewer problems in the world, we actually get more nitpicky to find problems. So it can be more difficult to find things that bring us pleasure, and it can be easier to find problems, to find reasons to be upset. So you can see how, if we're talking about survival negativity bias, how that can increase the things, the quantity of stimulus, of quantity of input, quantity of things that can send us into that fight or flight mode, right? So it goes back to the first pillar, looking at the autonomic nervous system. And this also gets into strategies like meditation that can help us harness the power of neuroplasticity for the good of our brains and our minds. And also things like, I mentioned the book The Comfort Crisis. Michael Easter talks about doing challenging things. He talks, for example, about how he did this 30-something day trip to the Arctic. And when he was flying up there, he felt like that plane from, I think it was Seattle to Anchorage, felt cramped and all these things. And then after spending a month in the Arctic, when he took that same plane back, he was like, oh my gosh, it has hot water, it has a comfortable chair, it's temperature control. And he's like, this thing that felt like such a problem now felt like the ultimate luxury. So doing things like that to shift our perspective can be super valuable. And then getting into some of the work of meditation, because this can be a really powerful way to in some sense take control of our minds. And this is where I mentioned some of my epiphanies and the ability to sort of connect some of these dots. So there's another great book called Altered Traits by Daniel Goleman and Richard Davidson. Daniel Goleman is the psychologist who coined the term emotional intelligence and has had written some wonderful works over the years. They talk about traits versus states. So state is a temporary state that we're in, and then a trait is something that emerges and is more lasting over time. So if you spend enough time in a certain state, that can become a trait. And so there's evidence. So this book is called Altered Traits, and there's evidence for meditation around things like slowing brain aging and slowing the loss of gray matter, which are the neurons of the brain. There's really well documented effects on down-regulating genes like COX-2. You might have heard of COX-2 inhibitors. So NSAIDs like ibuprofen, these non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, they work on the COX-2 gene to downregulate that to reduce inflammation. Meditation can do that too. It can also lower levels of interleukin-6, of TNF alpha, CRP, C-reactive protein. So really, really wonderful effects. And that of course is relevant for inflammaging, right? So we're kind of tying some of these together. There's also a relevance here that I really have felt in the last few months and wanted to talk about, and that is, in order to understand it, let's talk for a moment about this notion of enlightenment. So Naval Ravikant has a great quote where he says something along the lines of, enlightenment is not a binary state. It's more of like, it's not like you're either enlightened or you're not, but it's like, how long are you enlightened? Enlightened is a state that you can be in. And even if you don't consider yourself enlightened, you might be in an enlightened state, 1% of the time or 10% of the time or 20% of the time. So it's not necessarily about achieving this end result as it is about spending more time in that state of enlightenment. And it could mean different things in different cultures, but ultimately there's a common elements of reduced suffering, heightened presence with decreased resistance, having a sense of connection rather than separation, right? Some people describe this notion of feeling like we're all one. So there's less need to protect and defend the self. I'll say self in air quotes, as in like the mind and the ego. And because of that, there's less need to be hypervigilant and less need to have a stress response overall. So there's a few different dots here to connect. We can still have sympathetic activity, to wake up, to learn, to exercise, but there's going to be less of it chronically because of that reduced need to be hypervigilant if one is able to achieve we'll boil this down here, but not necessarily that you have to become enlightened, but doing some of these techniques of meditation have been very helpful for me. And that's sort of the last thing that I want to share here. Thank you so much for listening to the Undercurrent podcast. If you're interested in learning more about how NeuFit and the newbie can impact your life, please visit our website at www.new.fit, that's neu.fit, so you can learn more about how it might integrate into your professional practice, how you can use it as a patient, and you can also connect with our team there. So I want to talk about a couple of these experiences that I've had in meditation. So I recently did a meditation retreat with a guy named Corey Muscara, and he has this wonderful approach to meditation. Also a great book called Stop Missing Your Life. Highly recommend that book also. So he talks about how some people use meditation because they're living a life that's out of alignment and they paint themselves into a corner, metaphorically speaking, and they use meditation to just pacify themselves, to feel better there. Whereas he talks about using meditation as a tool to cultivate our awareness and be able to face reality, to meet what's happening, and to understand where subconscious drives are causing us to do things that we may not consciously or intentionally wish to be doing. So this, of course, will tie back into the autonomic nervous system and the discussion that we're having. But going through this retreat and going through his course and program, I had this really interesting observation where, for me, I had some of this pattern inside of always wanting to consume information, to learn more, try to be the smartest person in the room, try to always wanted to learn. And it was coming from a place, as I really slowed down and checked in and evaluated this, I saw it was coming from a place of feeling like I wasn't good enough, wasn't worthy of love or respect or affection or whatever it might be. Probably a childhood pattern, right? Nothing negative about my parents or anything like that, but this pattern. And so I would constantly want to learn more, thinking that, oh, if I just knew that, or if I was just smarter, if I was just learn more about this topic and that topic, that I'd somehow be better and more complete and more worthy. And it was really fascinating. Well, first of all, you can probably tell how, if I have that pattern running subconsciously, I'm constantly being hypervigilant, trying to find ways to defend myself, right? If I'm afraid someone's going to see that I'm not smart enough or I'm not good enough, I'm constantly looking for potential sources of threat to my status, my ego, my mind, and I'm always trying to look for ways to improve or adjust or maneuver and defend. And in this case, compulsively learn and read books and consume podcasts and audiobooks and all that stuff. And that all is good. It just depends a lot on the underlying motivation and inspiration behind it. And it was really fascinating. The several weeks, actually more than a month after this retreat, I had this experience where when I was driving my daughter to and from dance and sitting out in the parking lot at the dance studio and stuff like that, where I normally would be like, quasi compulsively reading or listening to an audiobook, I was just, walking, enjoying nature, listening to music. And I was just like, okay with that. I had this deep sense of, you know what, I'm okay. I don't need to cram that next bit of information into my brain. And it was this really interesting shift. And that's part of why I shared with you my Whoop score about how my HRV has improved so significantly since I started tracking and regularly meditating. And it made a profound, subjective psychological difference. And also that translated to this objective difference in my HRV. So it helps my autonomic nervous system. And it was just a profound experience for me. And that was one of the real epiphanies that helped me see these connections between how these various subconscious patterns that can be running in the background of our minds, egos, and of us, how they can be, even if it's subtly triggering this sympathetic stress response, and how identifying those and sort of running, I think meditation in some ways is like a software debugging for the mind, how that can help us dramatically in the area of the autonomic nervous system, which, of course, as we talked about, is very important for longevity, and also just my subjective quality of life. I mean, it was already good. I'm grateful. There's a lot of things, a lot of great things in my life, and I generally feel good, and a lot of wonderful things. And it got even better from adding in a more regular, structured meditation practice. So that was a really great experience. I just can't say enough good things about it. And so I mentioned Cory Muscara, his book, Stop Missing Your Life. I also love Shauna Shapiro's book, Rewire Your Mind, and Sam Harris's book, Waking Up. 3 really good resources on meditation. So I encourage everybody, of course, you got to find something that would work for you, but to explore some sort of practice in that general mindfulness category, because to me, that sort of is the meta skill, sort of the first domino in terms of quality of life. Like we talked about, autonomic nervous system sort of being the first domino of many of these things that happen health process wise in the body. To me, that it's sort of like the operating system underlying booting up of our internal operating system. It's just so fundamental and foundational. Can't say enough good things about how that has helped me. And then I finally do, as we wind down, want to touch on this notion of psychoneuroimmunology, because it ties together what we talked about with this, psychology in the mind and how that works related to meditation, especially. It ties in neurology, neuroscience, autonomic nervous system, and immunology, the immune system, inflammaging, right? All these different things. So it's sort of the concept that is the kind of the common thread throughout all of these, and ties a nice bow on the topic of this podcast. And it's really fascinating. Back in the 1970s, a psychologist named Robert Ader, Ader, and an immunologist named Nicholas Cohen, they did these experiments where they gave rats sweetened water that had a drug that suppressed their immune system. And over time, they started actually associating the sweetened water with the drug. And so they were able to do these experiments and show that they could give the rats sweetened water without the drug, and it would actually shut down their immune system. So this was the birth of this concept of psychoneuroimmunology, where the perception of taste from that sweet water, just without the drug at all, that triggered their brains to shut down their immune system. And so it talked about how, or it speaks to this direct connection, and it's a two-way street, direct connection between the brain and the immune system. And there's also a connection between the immune system and the brain. If you have inflammation, significant amounts of inflammation in your body, because you have a hypersensitivity to some sort of food, or you're sick, right, and your body's creating a lot of inflammation, that signals the brain to actually shut down energy production. And that is essentially your brain saying, hey, we don't need energy right now for higher level cognitive function, or your muscles for saying, we don't need energy right now for higher level physical function. We have to conserve that energy to fight off this infection or whatever it might be. And so it's a two-way street. But I think it really ties together in a beautiful way, the connections here, and hopefully leaves you feeling inspired to explore ways that you can measure and influence your own autonomic nervous system balance. Maybe ways that you could explore or deepen, double down on, if you already have one, a mindfulness practice of your own. And I think ultimately looking at longevity through this neuroscience lens, we're not necessarily talking about things that are different than what others talk about, but we may look at them differently, may prioritize them differently, may feel greater conviction to implement certain things that we might not otherwise feel. And so I hope this was useful to you, and that you find this topic as interesting and compelling as I do, and feel inspired to take action in response to this time that we've spent together here today. So thank you for tuning into this episode of the Undercurrent podcast. If you're enjoying it, please consider leaving a review on Apple, on Spotify, on YouTube, any place that you interact with this podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you on the next episode.